Welcome in, everyone, to Beyond the Beat with 32 Beat Writers. My name is Zach Hyduk, and I am here today with Courtney Cronin. Courtney is a national award-winning journalist and reporter with ESPN, NFL Nation, covering the Chicago Bears. She's also a national host on ESPN Radio and makes regular appearances on SportsCenter, First Take, and of course, I'm sure you've seen her on Around the Horn, as well as heard her on ESPN 1000 in Chicago. If you're looking for her on X or Twitter, you probably already know where to find her, but Courtney R. Cronin. Courtney, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for this platform too, because I think the work I'm a recent follow. So my good friend Jordan Rodrigue had been promoting her episode that she did, I think, a couple of weeks ago with you guys. So I had a chance to learn what you did, and thank you for giving beat writing this platform, because in the world of all of these aggregate accounts, especially during training camp, it can be pretty tricky to actually get the pulse on what's going on with your favorite team. So the work you guys do is tremendous, and I'm just grateful to be here.
Yeah, no, thanks. When I saw that you followed us in that kind of slew, and we've got a shout out from a couple of people recently, and it's been really awesome. Of course, you mentioned, having Jordan on the show. She's always great to talk with. And then, it's been great to get to know you a little bit here right before the show, and just continue to make connections and build that platform out. So of course, we're thankful to have you on as well. And I'm glad that you're here with us. It was interesting. So Zach Ring, there's two Zachs on the team here. You don't really see Ring very much because he prefers to stay in the shadows. But he actually, when you worked with the Clarion Ledger, he kind of knew who you were. He didn't know you personally or anything, so he was super hyped to have you on. So it's just kind of interesting.
Blast from the past. That was about a decade ago at this point for me, but it is cool. Like it's always, I was doing a radio interview actually in Memphis of all places today, and the host brought up, my connection with Gardner Minshew. I covered him at Brandon High School, and now he's QB1 for the Las Vegas Raiders. It's always wild seeing when you work in an area that has such a talent-rich pool in terms of the athletes that come out of there, how many of them you've known since they were 16, 17 years old and are now, doing it big in the NFL. It's a pretty cool full circle moment for a beat writer.
Yeah, that's got to be really interesting. And now, of course, as we mentioned, you cover the Bears as well as do a whole host of other things. But, the Bears have had a very busy off season. Mostly, I mean, they've made some changes elsewhere, but they've been really stacking this offense. It looks completely different as opposed to last year. And I'm excited to dig into that with you. So we'll get right into it with the training camp and the preseason, if you're okay with that. Basically, kind of the whole show here, we want to know what exactly have we seen through the preseason and through the training camps that they've had, and what we can expect from them. As we mentioned, they had some major changes. They drafted Caleb Williams, number 1 overall, which everybody watching would, of course, know. Of course, Rome Odunze at 9 at wide receiver, and they brought in Shane Waldron at offensive coordinator from the Seahawks. Just generally speaking, how are all of these offseason changes and additions going to impact the Bears and their offense?
It's going to look like a modern offense, which it hasn't, frankly, the last couple of years. And beyond just the Justin Fields era in Chicago, the offense was kind of non-existent. I mean, you think about, I know this is kind of this like fun thing earlier in training camp when Johnny Morris, who is the team's all-time leading receiver with just over 5,000 yards in a season, that they brought him in to meet the guys, to meet Keenan Allen, to meet DJ Moore, to meet Rome Odunze. And it's a very nondescript older gentleman. And that's the team's leading receiver. That is the bar, the very low bar that has not been raised, or the threshold has not been pushed in the last, several years. So you take a look at what surrounds Caleb Williams now that he is QB1 in Chicago and has been QB1 for, since the day he got here, more or less, really since the time they knew they were going to draft him, and he starts learning the playbook and the concepts in April. He comes into a place where the cupboard's not bare. So for a passing offense that, got as high as 27 last year, that's standard, and it wasn't acceptable then. You remember when Matt Eberflus talked about it's just not good enough. That threshold, that can't be it anymore. Not with the amount of talent that they have offensively at the skill position surrounding the number 1 overall pick. It's why it's the best situation a number one overall pick at quarterback has ever entered. And that's not hyperbolic. That's true based on the situations those guys usually go to and what Chicago usually looks like when they're drafting as high as number one. And I mean, they haven't drafted that high in forever, but having a top 10 pick is something that they've done before. And the team's usually not in a great spot. It was a much different set of circumstances for how Caleb Williams made his way to Chicago this year and the situation that he inherits, more or less.
Yeah, I do think it's interesting. Like you said, they didn't really earn that number one overall pick. They bought it. And so the fact that they're able to use that on a quarterback, hopefully bringing him into a better situation, and hopefully can deliver a better result than some first overall picks go to. I'm just a little bit curious, just focusing in on Shane Waldron at offensive coordinator a bit. What style of offense specifically, if you're able to tell us? I know sometimes, there's only so much you can say, but what kind of offense and what kind of styles do you think that we expect them to run? Last year, they were kind of middle of the pack. I think maybe 17 overall, at least in points scored. They had Geno Smith, DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, Jackson Smith, and Jigba, and then the running backs there as well. What kind of style do you expect them to use? And is it a 1-for-1, or do we expect them to be different in any capacity?
Well, you're right to think kind of like middle of the pack. I think that's probably the best way to describe the Shane Waldron offense for the 3 seasons he was the OC in Seattle. Like had some really good players. Obviously, DK Metcalf and Jackson Smith and Jigba are the highlight members of that receiving core, but it wasn't the most prolific passing offense. It wasn't the greatest running offense. Like just very much middle of the road. And I do think that there is some carryover to what he did when he was the pass game coordinator in LA with the Rams, and then going all the way to Seattle, and now to what he's going to do in Chicago, that we'll see. That does look similar to what the Bears ran last year, albeit with more talent. Because these West Coast offenses, I think Cole Kmet said it, multiple times throughout the preseason. The concepts, by and large, you'll see a lot of them pop up around the league. And it is like, not like that you're going to be seeing wholesale changes elsewhere. Everybody's going to have their terminology. There will be differences in certain places, but like, the 12 personnel part of this offense for the Seattle Seahawks. I mean, they used multiple tight end sets at the 4th highest rate of any team since Shane Waldron was their OC, dating back to when he got there, I believe in 2021. And then, of course, like play action rate was really, right around like one of the highest in the NFL. It was 27% of the time that he had the quarterback on the move, which again, as we see the very basics of this in the preseason, you're seeing a lot of play action dropbacks, the rollouts for Caleb Williams to get the quarterback on the move. He was able to do that in Seattle with Russell Wilson, with Geno Smith. And now you have somebody who you're playing to the strengths of your quarterback. You're going to lean on that element of his game, knowing he can make every throw on the move, as we saw the 45-yarder to Rome Odunze in the 3rd preseason game against the Cincinnati Bengals. But, conceptually, I know it's kind of that old like cliche that there's one ball and a lot of really talented players. That's kind of the thing we've all been trying to figure out in training camp. What does the target share look like when you have 3 receivers that very well could be a number 1 receiver on any other team? You have a good stable of running backs. DeAndre Swift, I think, has had one of the better camps of any offensive player for the Bears. A lot of screen passes coming his way, something that was not utilized as much for his skill set in Philadelphia, something he was good at and displayed in Detroit. That element is coming into the fold here. And certainly, the tight ends. I mean, Mercedes Lewis is, I don't know why I first decided to go with Mercedes Lewis. He is the 3rd tight end in this offense. And he's a great blocker, but it is the Cole Kmet and Gerald Everett tight end room. So 3 that should round it out as when the 53 comes out. But there's a lot of layers to this, whereas before, in years past, like particularly with Justin Fields, the last 2 years with Luke Getsy, it felt more one-dimensional. And a lot of it rode on the shoulders of the quarterback in the run game, specifically riding the shoulders of the quarterback, which will not be the case here with Caleb Williams.
Yeah, he should be able to deliver a lot more in the passing game, one would hope, and I think we've already seen some of that. As you mentioned, that pass to Rome Odunze was awesome and super exciting to see. And so hopefully we get to see more of that. I don't think we'll get to see him tonight, though. Is that correct?
Correct. So there's majority of starters are not playing. So I would imagine, because I get asked that question, had been asked it a couple times this week, who's going to play? I would think it'd be like Jaquan Brisker, and maybe that's it. So like the Bears, one of the Bears starting safeties has not played in any of the preseason games to date because he's been dealing with an injury. I could see that, and probably that's it, because they've seen 43 snaps from Caleb Williams and the starters on offense, and they said that's enough. And I think that's the right call, ultimately, based on what you got from him in the Buffalo game, and then watching him work through, kind of a rut that they were in last week in the first quarter of that game against the Bengals, and then coming through with his first touchdown drive of the preseason.
Okay. All right. Well, we got a lot of questions. We put a tweet out and we had a ton of responses. So if you responded to that and are watching or listening, thank you for doing that. We may not be able to get to all of them, but we'll just kind of start with Caleb Williams and then we'll move through the position groups here. So far, we've mentioned some of the passes and the performances that he's had in the preseason, but just plain and simple, is he what we had hoped?
I think so. And I know it's early. And I know that like everybody's oogling over some of the plays that he's made that are, out of structure. But I think it's what he's doing in structure as well that is impressive. Nothing really demonstrates that more than the final drive that they had, ultimately what was his final drive of the preseason. So those 4 plays, he hits a Dunze, he's rolling to his left, making the crossbody throw, off platform, hits a Dunze, the thing you can't teach. Okay, that's Caleb Williams. That is the stuff that makes somebody the number 1 overall pick. But what about the moment where he goes through his progressions on the 7-yard scramble, realizes I'm just going to run this thing in for a touchdown? That's him learning in real time and executing in real time, taking what the defense gives you, because the biggest difference, and this is not like a groundbreaking thing, the biggest difference between him and Justin Fields in those moments, Justin doesn't even think to pass in that moment. That's just what that would have been. Caleb, talked about like wanting to go through his progressions, and even when he goes into scramble mode, his first instinct is I've got to pass, and that's something that again sounds so basic, but it's just the Bears have been void of that at the quarterback position, of somebody who has that skill set who can do both. That was a very encouraging sign of growth, I think, for him in operating in and out of structure. So I'd say as good as advertised, like that whole idea, like, yeah, he's the number 1 overall pick for a reason. And the way that you've seen over now, they've been in camp since July 20th was their first practice. So we're more than a month into this thing, 3 preseason games down. The days where it looked its ugliest, it wasn't like there was a whole week of that. There might have been 2 days where the offense gets stopped in the 2-minute drill. Like they can't convert anything. There are a couple days, like right around the time before that Buffalo game, where it's just like, it just doesn't look good today. Some of that's going against a defense that's as good as the Bears defense is. Now, are they the number 1 defense in the NFL? I think people are throwing around rankings a little too prematurely there, but they're still like a very, very good unit. Like I said this on my podcast the other day, like they should enter the season top 10 status. I don't know if I'm going to put them in top 5 status just yet, just until we know what this pass rush ultimately looks like and how effective it is. But like Caleb's going against a very good test every day in training camp. And that is what is going to help him when he gets into these regular season games, when he's already seen a lot of coverages that were new to him. I mean, he talked about why he felt he had to play in the preseason, and some of it's just, seeing other people's defenses, seeing a defense that looks like yours, like Buffalo did, and what doesn't look like yours, which is that odd structured defense that the Bengals have, and being able to feel the umbrella of the defense, know where you need to flip protection, where you need to change protection, if you need to audible, like all of the things that are required from him at game speed. Doing that in the preseason was a nice warm up for him to get ready for that week 1 game against the Titans.
Yeah, I do think it is important to mention, and I was listening to you on that Chicago Bears radio podcast you were mentioning, he had struggled a little bit in some practices, but again, yeah, reminding us who he's actually going up against in those
Yeah,
practices. Some of these rookie quarterbacks are going up against the equivalent of like a white paper towel, or in practices, and that's probably not the case here with Caleb Williams. So just keeping all of that in mind and knowing that just because he throws an interception doesn't mean that was a horrible play. Maybe he was coached to throw the ball there regardless. So,
and they have said like there are moments, like there was times like this was like the Tuesday and Wednesday before the Buffalo game that like he forced a throw that he knew he should not have. And like it was to Gerald Everett in the 2-minute drill. And I believe this was the one picked off by it's either Kevin Byard. We were going back and forth because it was like, was it 31 or 21? Was it Jalen Jones or Kevin Byard who picked the pass off? Again, this is the beat writer in me that like goes and dives into the minutia of that. And like I just remember like thinking afterwards, what's the learning moment there? And when we talked to him next, and we talked to the offensive coordinator next when they were at the podium, then he knew immediately what the issue was there. And like some of that's no, we want him to try to fit the ball into a tight window. We want him to try to take some chances there. Other things are, yeah, he knows that wasn't the right play for him to utilize, to do what he did. And so it's a good test to have a good defense to go against. And I mean, it's been going against him for a month. I'm sure he'd rather play somebody else right now. And I don't know if that's going to make his job necessarily easier, but he got a nice crash course at NFLing as a quarterback playing this defense in practice.
Yeah, well, we'll get to see that in a couple of weeks, I guess, when they open up against Tennessee, and we can talk a little bit more about that towards the end if we have a chance. There were concerns. We've been talking preseason about the usage of the wide receivers, specifically with the rookie Rome Odunze. As you told us at the top, they've got 3 guys that kind of could be wide receiver ones on a lot of different teams. And, DJ Moore basically did that last year. Keenan Allen did that with the Chargers. And then, of course, when you draft a guy number 9 overall, that's what you essentially expect, even if the production is shared among those 3 guys. But we had a lot of questions specifically related to this. So overall, how do these wide receivers fit into the offense? And Adam Koffler specifically asked, why does Shane Waldron insist on 12 personnel when he has Rome Odunze on the roster? Is this a redshirt season for Odunze so long as Keenan Allen stays healthy?
I don't view it as that. And I'll say I was like trying to connect the dots in my head of like when the order in which things happen. So in free agency, Gerald Everett gets signed before they end up trading for Keenan Allen. That was a very long week because Justin Fields was traded there too, traded within all of that. So I'm pretty sure I have my timeline there. A lot of it is let's just get the best players in that we possibly can. And Gerald Everett was someone who followed Shane Waldron to Chicago, had played for him, in previous stops, felt that, with his usage with the Chargers last year, and knowing like, okay, I want to be a move tight end. I want to be a hybrid. I want to fit into some role in a passing offense because we know that, it's what we've seen in limited sample size, but in training camp and in these preseason games, there's a moment for Caleb Williams, sometimes second or third down, if they're backed up, to go target the tight end. And if that's Cole Kmet, that's one thing. But if it's Gerald Everett, like it's just a different element that it brings to the offense. But I bring all this, I say all that to like set up how free agency worked out. And then a month later, they didn't know they were going to get Rome Odunze. They knew they were drafting Caleb Williams number 1 overall when they had that, when they checked the final box. But when it came to Rome Odunze at 9, and you remember like seeing the videos that the team put out of Ryan Poles getting nervous. Hey, he might not be there. Should we trade up? Should we, Ian Cunningham, the assistant general manager, kind of having to talk him off the ledge a little bit of no, let's stay patient here. Like, let's not try to trade up to 6 to go get him with the Giants. It's like getting good players in here. It's so different. The cupboard was bare for Justin Fields. They want to give Caleb Williams the best chance to succeed. So you're going to do that by bringing a ton of players in. It's kind of like get the personnel first and then worry about a lot like the different usage and all of that. And, what we do know like based on history though, because like of what he's done. So like I pulled the numbers for like, 3 receiver sets, so 11 personnel versus 12 personnel, like, so 3 receivers versus 2 on the field, with 2 tight ends. Like there were more 3 wide receiver looks in Seattle's offense in 2023, which ended up taking away from some of the 12 personnel that they ran, but they still utilized it more frequently. I think I said 4th highest rate in the NFL over the last 3 years, but like last year, they still used it more than like league average, more or less. I tend to think, based on how they invested in Gerald Everett in free agency, not, record breaking money by any stretch, but for a tight end too, like they're still going to use him quite a bit. Does that mean that Rome Odunze's targets are going to go down? I don't know if we know who the number 1 receiver is in this offense yet. And that's a weird thing to say when you have like DJ Moore coming off a career year. It could change week to week, which like when I sat down with Caleb about a month ago and I asked him, does this offense need a number 1 receiver? And that's really speaking to the talent, because we always get into the nitty gritty of this guy is, he's going to have the target share. He's going to have like the bulk of everything. One week that may be DJ Moore, one week that may be Keenan Allen. The connection between Caleb and Rome is building. And there was a time right before the draft where, again, nobody knew that Rome was going to be a Bear, but they all worked out together. I don't know if you remember hearing about this, where Caleb organized a throwing session with Keenan and DJ, knowing he was going to be teammates with them, but Rome was around and said, hey, let's just, let's come join us. And he goes out on he goes out on like a goal ball or something, and he catches it, like, and Keenan Allen says to Caleb, there's your deep threat. And he said it about Rome Odunze, and it's like, of course you can see that, the numbers and what he did on passes of 20 plus yards in Washington. But DJ Moore is also capable of that sort of thing. So it's like, how do you differentiate between the skill sets to figure out who helps you in certain moments, in certain situations, down in distance over others? And it's hard to like hypothesize until you see it, because even in Shane Waldron's offenses before that have had, again, the talent that I mentioned in Seattle last year at the receiver position, like this is probably the most talent that he's had in an offense top to bottom. And I know you can think about some of those Rams teams, but he wasn't the play caller on those Rams teams, pass game coordinator. When you think about like Cooper Kupp and the receiver groups out there. But I just tend to think that like there's going to be a time and a place for Rome Odunze, certainly in this offense. He's explosive. He's a big body threat. As we saw from that 45-yarder, a 50-50 ball might be 101 in his mind, 100-0 in his mind, because he's such a contested catch monster. It's just difficult to figure out, okay, like how does the target share split? Like, what does that target share look like? What do the splits look like when you have 3 receivers capable of being number 1s and in multiple tight ends, whether it's in the red zone with Cole Kmet and even with Gerald Everett too, over the middle of the field, that give you viable passing options within this offense? It's going to be a challenge, I think, for Shane Waldron, a good problem to have, to figure out what's the best matchup that you want to manipulate here. And I know from what he said about 12 personnel, and I promise I'll stop rambling on this.
Well, this is good. This is all good.
He was asked about it recently, and he said, why do you like having so many multiple like tight end? Why do you like utilizing so many multiple tight end sets? And what does that group do for you? And he's like, well, if the group is the depth of the team, it presents a matchup advantage every week. And they do have a lot of depth there. Once you can do more than line up either as an inline blocker or more than just an F tight end that like all you do is run routes, and you're on the outside and you can run routes, like that makes you multiple, like, right? Like that's every coach says, we want to be multiple. We want to like be able to present a look and do something completely different out of it. So how often did they pass out of 12 personnel, last year? Like, actually those numbers ended up going, it was flipped. They ran out of it a lot in 2022, and then they passed out of it more in 2023 in Seattle. So there's a variation there. But I do think that like the people that he has and will be calling plays for on top of the quarterback play will allow them to have a lot of different looks out of a lot of different personnel groupings that will end up, ultimately helping them be a much better, much more complete offense than they had been.
Yeah, and no, do not apologize for rambling and giving us extra information. That is what we love having here. You mentioned, some of the inconsistencies maybe with DJ Moore. He's very, very good, but I happen to be at one of the better games that he had, and everybody who's listening is probably tired of me mentioning this. But that I was at that Washington game where he just put up ridiculous numbers,
On
3
like
touchdowns.
5-yard slants. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, it was
The catch and run stuff. I thought you were going to end up saying that was the game, because everybody looks at that and be like, holy moly, 3 touchdowns, I believe a career day for him in terms of yardage as well, in the midst of a career year. A lot of that were screen passes and slants that he ends up taking. He can make anybody miss, take 60 yards to the house. Those look inflated. I don't think you don't have to get away with that. You know what I mean? Like, manufacture those sorts of yards with dump offs and with having your number one receiver outrun everybody else after you just scoot him the ball, more or less. Like, there's just I think you're going to get a much more complete version of DJ Moore, instead of just like the version that had to like compensate for the quarterback play last year that he had himself and Justin Fields. But they had one of the highest QBRs between a quarterback and wide receiver, or the quarterback. Justin had one of the highest QBRs in terms of quarterback wide receiver duo last year. I think Tyreek and Tua were number 1, and those two ended up finishing top 5 because of how often he targeted him, no matter where it was. And, DJ coming through on his end with that.
Yeah. Yeah. And the 3 receivers that they have, I probably know the least about Rome. With Keenan, I mean, you've got a very good zone beater. With Moore, you've got a very good man beater. And so with the addition of Odunze, like, if they're in a 2 wide receiver set, who do you think will be on the field? Obviously, rookies sometimes take a little bit. But how do you feel like those 3 kind of play together? Or if, obviously if they're in a 3 wide receiver set, we probably expect those 3 guys to be on the field. But if they're just a 2, how do they utilize them? And is what I was talking about with the man and zone, do you think that will hold up in kind of their tendencies?
I do. And I think, why did they bring Keenan Allen in? I know that he's gotten this. He's, put up his second best season of his career, despite missing a couple games with I believe it was an ankle injury or ankle or foot last year. Like, he's a quarterback's best friend. And over the middle of the field, I expect him to be that security blanket for Caleb Williams. And it's funny because there was some weird thing about, like, he was like, did you see that this week where he was like I don't even think I noticed it until it was brought up, like, about him being labeled wrong weight wise on the Bears roster, and people are like, is he slow, is he out of shape? I can assure you, from seeing him in practice, especially this week where he was just like torching dudes in the red zone, the best indication of like everything's fine with Keenan Allen was when Tyreek Stevenson talked at the podium the other day, and like the name Keenan Allen was brought up, and just like slumps his shoulders. Like, got to face this guy. Like, he frustrates the hell out of these DBs because of how well he runs his routes. So all is fine there. I understand he's 32 years old. He's in a contract year, but like, as far as if it's going to be Keenan and DJ in 12 personnel when there's 2 receivers out there over like Keenan and Rome or anything, like, I think a lot of it ends, of course, it's matchups, like based on like body size. Like, are you going to have DJ Moore? Like, Keenan can line up in the slot. Like, that's one thing that like he talked about as like being a big part of his game and like where we've seen him quite a bit. But there are also times like, if it's just the 2 of them out there, you're going to have both of them, on the outside trying to win matchups, and, a tight end coming over the middle. So I think it's difficult to tell just with like their tendencies just yet and what they've seen from their group. I think they feel that they can line them up anywhere. But as far as mixing, whether it's going to be Rome Odunze coming in with DJ Moore or like whatever the chess pieces are, they have a lot of options of how to get there.
Yeah. I think that's, again, what kind of makes this whole thing super interesting. And I did want to ask you, there was questions in the chat about it too. Somebody was asking if he was on the Eddie Lacy diet or something like that. But yeah, I had no idea. It kind of just popped up and everybody's like, was he listed as 230 or something like that?
230, and like
freaking out.
I don't know. No, he's looked really good in training camp. For Caleb, again, this is like stuff that happened right before training camp, but like he has really dedicated himself to helping the quarterback learn the offense, because he says like he's a rep learner. He's got to be able to rep it. He's not just going to like see it once and get it. He's got to be able to see it and go through it again and again and again. So during the preseason or during OTAs and minicamp, they were in the team hotels, like him, Caleb, John Jackson, who's Caleb's roommate, who was a former USC and Nevada receiver, who's a UDFA here in Chicago. He had a chance to go like learn the offense with a 12-year vet, and they would sit down, they'd watch the NBA finals, they'd play this Monopoly card game, and they would go through everything together. So Caleb got an education on this offense from somebody who has, been around the block, who has had multiple offensive coordinators, who now is learning this offense too. And I think that he's in a really good position just from a learning standpoint of trying to get up to speed, but also giving himself a little bit of grace, just knowing, okay, I'm a rookie. Somebody else, 12-year vet, I can't put myself on the same wavelength here. But also that could help him see how Keenan Allen sees the offense. So like when there are, if he only has two of them out there, and if they're not in 11 personnel, then maybe there is some sort of tendency or tell that Keenan can relay to him that ends up helping the offense with a net gain, because he's been because Keenan's involving himself in that play, if that makes sense, and based on something that the two of them would have talked through and seen. But other than him doing really well in training camp practices, like there might have been some days where DJ came away with more targets. I think Rome actually, when we hear like the buzz around him, I think it's only started really within the last week and a half or so, probably because they didn't connect for that touchdown on third down in Buffalo. And we didn't see, we saw there are a couple times in 7-on-7 and team drills in training camp where, they connected, or there might've been like a flag thrown. And of course there was the would have been touchdown had Rome had his feet in bounds, but like, it's just, there's a lot of growth going on as he's trying to establish his connection with multiple different pass catchers.
Yeah. Is there anybody else in the wide receiver room that you think we should pay attention to?
Tyler Scott, the 4th-round pick from a year ago. Caleb really liked that ball that he threw to him on the 43-yard defensive pass interference call. Like he thought it was on the money. And I know I remember seeing the comments on that right away, like, oh, we threw it late, or like, I thought for Tyler to track that ball, considering there were, some issues with that last year with him. And he's admitted that. He's talked about needing to get better in that area. Like, I thought their connection, like you won't see him that much when you have a receiver room that's this stacked, but I thought that was a good sign that will be used in spurts. Other than that, and we've got, our 53-man rosters for all of us at ESPN were due before the final preseason game. So I had to project, all right, who's 5 and 6. 6 may change after tonight. It could end up being Dante Pettis. It could be DeAndre Carter. I think some punt return capabilities in there are super important for the 6th receiver. I have the 5th as Velus Jones until further notice. I know a lot of people don't want to hear that, and a lot of people have already cut him in their minds. I don't know who's making, when you think about depth wise, I don't know who's making the roster over him. They had tried him at running back. They have still. That's still an experiment. I expect to see him out there tonight. So we'll see.
Okay. Well, we'll pay attention to that then. Diving into the running backs, you mentioned Swift a bit earlier. Last year, I was kind of excited to see Roschon Johnson, but he just never really took off. I don't think he started any games. He played in 15, had some injury stuff. KC in our chat was asking a little bit about him as well. What have they done with Roschon Johnson was his question. So is he going to have an expanded role at all this year? What do you think?
Yeah, it's going into camp. There was a school of thought that maybe they would try to trade Khalil Herbert and make Roschon Johnson their RB2, because they drafted Roschon Johnson. They didn't draft Khalil Herbert. Roschon's going into year 2. Khalil's in year 4, coming off of that ankle injury that he had in week 5, the game that you attended at Washington. I don't think he's been the same in terms of speed and burst since week 5 of last year and coming back, after he was activated off IR. But there have been too many guys going in and out of the lineup for the Bears, I think, at the running back spot to not carry all of them. So the 4 that you would carry would be DeAndre Swift, Khalil Herbert, Roschon Johnson, and Travis Homer, who's a special teamer, but could also, give you a change of pace in certain situations. I don't think you don't carry 4 plus a fullback, so 5. But it's Khalil's had a very strong preseason. I say, DeAndre Swift, I think among all the offensive players, has probably had one of the best, if not the best, of any skill guy, just because of all that he's been tasked with. But for Khalil, he got a lot of run in that first game against the Texans in the Hall of Fame game. He played a lot in Buffalo, a lot last week. Is it them showcasing him for another team that may get desperate here? I don't buy that, just because if you're going to cut him, everybody knows that. You know what I mean? So why would you give up a draft pick if that's the case? You just wait till cutdown day. I just don't see them doing that at this point. But Herbert, the bugaboo with Herbert is pass protection. That's where Roschon Johnson, I remember talking to him right after he was drafted, or talking to people in the building right after he was drafted. And the idea was, oh, you've got this complete package who just never had a chance to show it because Bijan Robinson was the star of that offense at Texas. But Roschon played he contributed a lot on special teams. He was one of their highest in terms of snap counts last year. But then additionally, he just never really had a chance to get going last year in that backfield. So this is the DeAndre. The reason they upgraded with Swift is because they want that complete 3-down back that they feel that they have, and also in him, and also the ability to catch passes out of the backfield, potentially even line up in the slot too. He's given them a lot of pass catching options, but you would like to think there will be a bigger role for Roschon Johnson this year, considering they did spend a 4th-round pick on him, and they like the potential that he gives them, in more than just, running the football. The pass protection element's huge. So whoever can win that part of the battle, whether, during practice, during the week, and whoever gives you the best chance to, okay, when we're lining up out here, this guy can block if it's going to be a pass play. That might not be Khalil Herbert. That might be Roschon Johnson, in a way for him to see an uptick in his production this year.
So you're saying that it kind of telegraphs to a defense more often if Herbert's in the game, what style of play it might even be then, huh? I guess I'm kind of inferring that. I'm not saying you're saying that exactly, but with Swift, you mentioned, and I'm a little bit curious if you could expand on it at all, just because you mentioned it. You think that he may be utilized a bit differently than he was with the Eagles. What do you mean by that?
So they didn't when he was in Detroit, one of the biggest things that stood out to the Bears was just, all the different ways that you could use him. And it just felt like that kind of went away when he was in Philadelphia last season. They just didn't use him much in the passing game. And that's an element for him that I know he says that he enjoys, and he feels he can be a weapon there. We have seen a lot of screen passes with these running backs. And it's not just him. We've seen it with, Khalil Herbert some, with Roschon Johnson when he's been in there. But that's DeAndre Swift's bread and butter. In addition to being that's what makes him part of what makes him a complete back. And to be able to, they were not a very good wide receiver screen team early on in the Justin Fields, Luke Getsy tenure. And they just didn't, seem to manifest themselves into being that with running backs as well. I think within this offense, and just knowing with the check downs, with the short passes, with the dump offs, with the tosses, those are a lot of plays with this outside zone that you can get those running backs on the move in, by passing the ball, by not having them run the ball. And that helps keep them multiple, helps force things to the outside. And, he's shown an ability to do that. And I imagine that that's going to be a big part of his game as well. And not even just in short yardage situations.
Yeah, that is really, really interesting. And I'm curious to see how that shakes out. With the tight ends, you've talked about it a good bit already, but they paid Cole Kmet a whole lot of money, especially for a tight end on that scale. I think it was last year they gave him like a
4 years,
4-year,
50.
50 million. Yeah. So that's a lot. But then, as we also talked about a little bit already, they brought in Gerald Everett, and some people are a bit concerned. They're wondering if the Komet production, especially if they're looking at things from a fantasy standpoint, is going to be threatened. They want to know, TJ specifically was asking, what do we make of the recent uptick in the Gerald Everett reps with the first team? And then I think we saw some stuff in the preseason as well, paired with the downturn of reps for Cole Kmet. What do you think?
Cole is to put it frankly, like a more traditional tight end role for Cole Kmet is probably where he excels more. And I know he's coming off a career year in terms of receiving yards. I think he had one less touchdown than his career high, which was 7 2 years ago. A lot of that ended up being just like the cupboard was bare. Like he was the red zone threat that Justin Fields needed just to survive. But you can do a lot with Everett because he's an athletic move tight end. So he's a hybrid receiver. It's kind of like the role that, the Bears were hoping, kind of dating myself here. So it's the role they were hoping, like with Trey Burton coming there a couple of years ago after his great season in Philly, that never really ended up manifesting itself at all. But I think for Cole, he's comfortable with the targets that he gets because he knows they're like impactful ones. Go back to the Bills game when they send him out on a route and Caleb's rolling to his right. I mean, Cole's trucking down the field and gets open on that play action 26-yard pass that gives them, helps them move the ball past the 50. Like those are plays that he can make. Like, is he still going to be a threat in the red zone? Yes. Might Gerald Everett also be a threat in the red zone? Sure. Like I think if you look back at his numbers of the Chargers last year, it wasn't consistent every single week, but when he was in the days that he was targeted, it was about twice a game inside the 20. Like having 2 tight ends down there, I think gives you more of a mismatch, but does that mean it's going to take away from Cole Kmet's targets? Not necessarily. I know that there have been times where it's felt like Caleb's locked in a little bit on Gerald Everett, and maybe that's just the byproduct of the way that the play was designed or whatever the progression was and what he felt he had to do in that moment. Like the one that he missed with him on the first series, I believe it was, against the Bengals, it kind of felt like he was forcing that one a little bit. But he's like, to have 2 tight ends that can, I don't want to say effectively do the same thing, because I think that they're different tight ends. And I mean, Gerald's a smaller player. Like, do you want him to block? I think he's much better suited in a hybrid receiving role for you where Cole can be an inline blocker. And does it seem like a lot for that position? Like what they paid him 2 years ago now, maybe, but he's a reliable part of this offense. He's a big part of the locker room. Like they made that move. That was the first major extension that Ryan Poles made as general manager. And I think 10 out of 10 times they would have done it again, even with the personnel they have now.
Okay. What do you think is the most important thing to watch in the remainder of the preseason, what little we have tonight, and then headed into the regular season?
Number one will be, are they going to try to upgrade the pass rush further? Because we know that they were in on Matthew Judon. They're trying to get him. They decided, hey, we're not trading for a guy that we don't have a contract extension already lined up with, because they did that with Montez Sweat and it ended up working out. But it's also somebody who's 27 years old who, they want in the building for a long time. So they're comfortable making him the highest paid player on the roster at that time. Like, that's not the case with Matthew Judon, who's 32 years old. So they decided, like, here's our line. We're not crossing it. So is there somebody else out there that they're willing to trade for? Maybe they just end up signing Unique Ngakoue, which we've been talking about this for months. I don't know if it'll happen at this point. I think the price has to be significantly lower than what it was last year, maybe like $4 or $5 million a year instead of like the 10 that was mostly guaranteed. But like, because that's my biggest holdup with them. Like, are you a top 5 defense? You got to be able to rush the passer. Once Sweat came here week 9, like, there's a reason there was an uptick in interceptions. There was a reason that the takeaways, like all of the things that helped the back end of the defense, started up front, but they still struggled to pressure the quarterback. So throughout the remainder of the preseason, because right now it's DeMarcus Walker and Montez Sweat as your opening day starting defensive ends. We know Jermon Dexter has shown the signs that he is making the jump in year 2. He's completely changed his body. Like, he's a huge dude. All he needs to do is stand up and just like throw his hands up, and he has a good chance of batting down a pass, which will be interesting to see when you face a smaller quarterback. And Caleb's not huge. He's like 6 foot. Like, when they face Kyler Murray, does that stuff happen? Because Javon did that a few times to Caleb, and I'm sure that that's a tool that the Bears want to use. But regardless, they've got to be able to pressure quarterbacks at a far more effective rate than they've done previously. So that's one thing I'm going to look at to see, like, is there any upgrade made? Because if there's not now, keep an eye on the trade deadline, because Ryan Poles has shown he's very aggressive in November, late October and November, in upgrading the roster, whether it works out or whether it doesn't. But outside of that, this is a hard roster to make. So much different than when you're having to choose between, Nicholas Morrow and Byron Pringle. You know what I mean? Like, this is like a legitimately hard roster. So what I'm looking for tonight when this preseason game happens is, what about like punt returner? So is it's Dante Pettis going to get those reps? Is it going to be DeAndre Carter? Like, what about like way down the depth chart at cornerback? Is Josh Blackwell making this team as the 7th corner? Or excuse me, it's Greg Stroman making this team as the 7th corner? Is Josh Blackwell already a lock? Like, there's a couple positions, but it's really like the main ones are set. Like, there's not a lot of, and they didn't enter training camp with a whole ton of positions that were up for grabs nearly as much as they had in years past. So Ryan Poles said it in day 3 of the draft. It's going to be a hard roster to make, and I imagine that there will be some tough decisions, just like with like depth guys. But then outside of that, I'd say offensive line. Because right now, Ryan Bates has been sidelined for the last it's been more than a week since before the Buffalo game. That stopped the center competition because he and Coleman Shelton were going back and forth. So the line that they have right now is probably, unless Bates is able to come back, the line that they run out with, roll out in week 1, which is Braxton Jones at left tackle, Tevin Jenkins left guard, Coleman Shelton center, Nate Davis at right guard, and then Darnell Wright at right tackle.
Right. Yeah, I know we've got a couple of questions, I think, about Darnell Wright specifically. How is he doing?
He's had a good camp. I think that, like, he's really taken to Montez Sweat and learning from him. The two of them were at practice the other day afterwards, kind of just going over, like, some stuff one-on-one. And Darnell has really come on, kind of come into his own over the last year. He played a ton as a rookie, and that's what they relied upon him to do. He's a top 10 pick for a reason. He's part of this offensive core, like 5 players that are signed through the 2027 season. He's taken his game to the next level. On the other side of that, it's, with Braxton Jones, who's had a good camp. Like, there really hasn't been any like complaints about him at left tackle, but a lot of that I think is because Karan Amageji was drafted knowing that they weren't going to get him out there right away. Like, there wasn't the optics of, oh, this guy is pushing you for your job in year 1. It was more, he's going to take some time. He just got activated off NFI. But, as it stands right now, I think that, and I know PFF put the numbers out, like they had Braxton Jones and Darnell Wright as 2 of the top 32 graded tackles. And that's, it's a little, sometimes you see it, you're like, wait, really? Because sometimes that doesn't pass the eye test, but if Braxton can continue to get better with, against a bull rush, then he'll be, and he's talked about like just improving upon that throughout the last 2 years. And that'll be a big part of what of his growth and just like, fortifying the left side of the line. But there really have been no complaints about Tevin Jenkins. He missed like 1 practice because like something, I don't know, some injury, something happened, but he was back. Nate Davis has practiced now for a full week, and his availability has come into concern. It's, brought out Matt Eberflus saying, along the lines of like, you got to be available to make this team more or less. So we'll see if that stays consistent. But no, I think if anybody asked me, like, I think like could there be something that trips up the Bears this year? I would say offensive line play and protection. Even for a quarterback who can do so much off schedule and when plays break down, he'll be fine. I still think that was the killer for Justin Fields in Chicago. Some of it on him, some of it on the line, but that's going to be the thing that has to hold up to make sure that Caleb Williams has a good season.
Okay. Yeah. And we'll see. You mentioned with the pass rush, I mean, you guys are going to face a couple of really good and interesting offenses this year. Just looking at Houston and LA and Arizona, Green Bay twice. We'll see what we get out of Minnesota, I guess, but Detroit. So you've got a lot of that on the schedule there. So we'll have to see how that works. I want to respect your time. We're coming up when I need to get you out of here. So we'll do the soapbox as is tradition here. You have approximately 60 seconds to stand on a soapbox and rant about any topic of your choosing. It does not have to be football related, but you have 60 seconds. Courtney, go.
So we talked about this on Around the Horn today, and I am just miffed by this idea that Oklahoma State football is putting QR codes on the back of players' helmets that are linked to an NIL fund. Good idea in theory. It's supposed to help some of the players who are not like the star marquee players who already have big NIL deals. Like, it's supposed to help those guys get their funds up. But these are tiny little QR codes on the back of helmets that move around a lot. As someone who hates QR codes, hates using them for menus at restaurants, hates using them on the TV to like log into my Netflix, it's not going to work for me as I'm like, trying to get this tiny little box to show up on my phone when I open up my photo app. So my idea would be, if you really want this to happen, after somebody scores a touchdown, throw it up in the Jumbotron in the end zone. It's also weird that a school that has T. Boone Pickens associated with it, that we have like any qualms about players getting paid and their NIL funds. But here we are, the tip jar going around college football is the QR code in the back of the helmet. Bizarre.
Yeah. When that dropped, it was really interesting. I think that's a great one for you to pick. And I saw somebody a tweet that was like, "Quick, honey, pause the TV, zoom in so that I can get my camera." I was like, it kind of makes sense. But like, even if you're on the sideline, I don't know how in the heck you're going to get that. So that makes sense. Your suggestion there. Maybe we'll see if they take your advice on that. Courtney, thanks again for joining us. Before we let you go, though, remind everybody where we can find you and what you do.
Yeah. I Twitter, Instagram at Courtney R. Cronin. I have all my Bears stuff up there. I also share links anytime I have appearances on any of our TV shows here at ESPN. We've got Around the Horn coming up at 5 Eastern time. I'm hosting for the next couple of days, so I'm very excited about that. And it's going to be a great season just in terms of how much coverage and attention there is on this team in Chicago that, at least for right now, feels like it's going for the right reasons instead of the last couple of years where it's been, how many games are they going to win? Will it be above 3?
Yeah, well, everybody tune in, make sure, in about a half an hour then to check Courtney out on Around the Horn specifically. Thanks, everybody, for joining. Thanks again to you, Courtney, and also make sure to check out our website at 32beatwriters.com, where we have player training camp news summaries, player tracking tools, and more. Make sure you keep up there for all the most recent and relevant information from the beat writers. For Courtney Cronin, I am Zach Heiduch, and we will see you guys next time.